A metropolis of millions stands empty, its grand canals choked with silt and its temples reclaimed by jungle. This is the haunting legacy of ancient cities like Angkor Wat and Cahokia, places of stunning sophistication that were ultimately abandoned. Today, we will unravel one of history's deepest mysteries, exploring why brilliant civilizations chose to walk away from their greatest creations. By the end, you will gain a powerful new lens for understanding our own world's challenges with climate and community. We will examine why a society would leave behind intricate water systems and towering monuments, and what silent stones can teach us about survival. What do you believe is the greatest threat to a civilization's endurance? Their brilliance is precisely what makes their silence so deafening. To understand why a city is left behind, we must first grasp the staggering heights it reached. Think of a civilization not as a simple village, but as a living organism, one that learned to reshape the very land to sustain its heartbeat. The Khmer Empire at Angkor offers a masterclass in this. In a landscape ruled by punishing dry seasons and torrential monsoons, Khmer engineers performed a kind of geographic alchemy. They constructed vast reservoirs called barrays, some stretching over 5 miles long, alongside a complex network of canals and moats. This was not just about storing water for drinking. It was a sophisticated hydraulic machine designed to capture floodwaters, redistribute them for agriculture throughout the year, and even stabilize the foundation for their monumental temple mountains. This system supported a population that scholars believe reached 1 million people, a scale unmatched in the medieval world. Half a world away and millennia earlier, another city demonstrated a different kind of genius. Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley thrived with a quiet, orderly precision that feels startlingly modern. Its streets were laid out in a deliberate grid, with buildings made from standardized, kiln-fired bricks. But the true marvel lay beneath the surface. The city boasted an advanced, city-wide sanitation system, with individual homes connected to covered drains that channeled waste away from living areas. This was urban planning with a profound concern for public health and civic order, a system that would not be seen again in many parts of the world for thousands of years. These places were far more than collections of buildings. They were hubs of astronomy where priests tracked the stars to mark the seasons. They were centers of art and governance, connected by trade routes that moved spices, textiles, and ideas across continents. Their infrastructure was the physical manifestation of their knowledge, a testament to human collaboration and problem-solving on a grand scale, which is why their empty plazas and silent canals pose such a compelling riddle. When a society can move mountains of earth and direct the flow of rivers, what force could possibly be powerful enough to make them lay down their tools and leave? The unsettling truth is that the very foundation of their success often contained the seeds of their vulnerability. The environment that nurtured their rise could, with a subtle shift, orchestrate their fall. The most sophisticated infrastructure can become a city's own cage. This is the paradox of environmental degradation, a slow and often invisible force that unravels civilizations from the ground up. Consider the ancient Maya at Tikal, a city of towering pyramids that pierced the jungle canopy. For generations, the surrounding rainforest was their provider, offering timber, game, and fertile soil. But to feed a growing population and build their stone monuments, the Maya cleared vast tracts of that forest. This wasn't a sudden act of destruction, but a gradual transformation over centuries. Without the tree roots to hold the soil in place, tropical rains washed away the nutrient-rich topsoil. The land's ability to retain water diminished, and agricultural yields began to drop. The very act of sustaining their greatness was quietly stripping the land of its ability to sustain them at all. This pattern of a society consuming its own foundation repeats across the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, engineers mastered the art of irrigation, diverting water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to create lush fields in the desert. But this brilliant solution contained a hidden flaw. As the irrigation water evaporated under the hot sun, it left behind tiny deposits of salt. Season after season, year after year, this salt accumulated in the soil of cities like Ur. Slowly, the fertile fields that fed empires became white-crusted and barren. The land could no longer support the population it had helped to create. These are not stories of sudden catastrophe, but of a creeping crisis. It is the tragedy of the commons where the shared resource, be it forest or fertile soil, is used by everyone for individual benefit until it is depleted for everyone's loss. The community's collective effort to thrive ultimately changes the rules of the game. When the land can no longer provide, the intricate social and economic systems built upon it begin to tremble. And this slow-burn resource crisis almost always ignites a more immediate and terrifying emergency: the struggle for water. Water is the silent architect of every civilization. When it vanishes, the blueprint for survival is erased. For societies that mastered their local environment, the greatest threat was not a bad season or two, but a fundamental, long-term shift in the climate itself. Modern science now gives us a window into these ancient weather patterns. By studying layers in ice cores from glaciers and sediments from lake beds, paleoclimatologists can read a history of rainfall and temperature stretching back thousands of years. The story these natural archives tell is often startling. They reveal periods of profound and persistent dryness, events we now call mega-droughts that lasted not for years but for decades or even centuries. And time and again, the timeline of these climatic disasters aligns eerily with the collapse of great cities. Take the Akkadian Empire, a powerhouse of ancient Mesopotamia, remembered as history's first true empire. Around 4,200 years ago, their centralized authority and vast trade networks suddenly fragmented. For a long time, historians pointed to political unrest or invasion. But the layers of sediment tell another, more elemental story. Evidence suggests the region was gripped by a drought so severe it may have lasted for 300 years. Imagine the slow, grinding pressure of that. No matter how vast your grain stores or how clever your administrators, a drought of that scale redefines what is possible. Farmland turns to dust, trade routes wither, and the social contract that holds an empire together begins to fray under the weight of hunger and scarcity. This pattern repeats across the globe. In the arid canyons of the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans, often called the Anasazi, were brilliant adapters. They built intricate cliffside dwellings like those at Mesa Verde, engineered sophisticated grids of terraced fields to conserve soil, and crafted elaborate systems to catch and channel every precious drop of rainwater. Their entire society was a masterpiece of efficiency within a challenging but predictable dry land environment. Then the climate shifted. Starting in the late 13th century, tree ring data reveals a period of intense and sustained drought coupled with colder temperatures. Their systems were designed for conservation, but not for a near-total absence of the resource they were built to manage. The very ingenuity that allowed them to flourish became irrelevant when the rains simply did not come for generation after generation. This reveals a profound and unsettling vulnerability. Infrastructure, no matter how advanced, is built for a known world. It is a solution to the problems of yesterday's climate. Canals are dug for a certain flow of rivers. Reservoirs are sized for a predictable range of rainfall. When the climate steps outside of those historical parameters for a long enough time, the solutions of the past become the relics of the present. The grand barret of Anchor, the clever cisterns of the Puebloans, these were not failures of engineering. They were monuments to a stability that had vanished. And a changing climate is never just a weather event. It acts as a powerful multiplier of every other weakness in a society. As resources shrink, cooperation often fractures. The shared struggle for survival can turn inward, transforming neighbors into competitors for the last remaining water or the final stores of grain. The environmental crisis becomes a social one, and the path to abandonment becomes a little clearer. A society can withstand a drought, but can it survive its own unraveling? Environmental pressures rarely act alone. They seep into the very fabric of a community, amplifying tensions and exposing fault lines that prosperity had once papered over. This is the third, deeply human factor in the story of abandonment: sociopolitical unrest and internal conflict. When scarcity arrives, the question of who gets what becomes the most urgent politics of all. In a thriving city, a stark divide between wealth and poverty might be an accepted, if uncomfortable, reality. But picture a place like the Roman city of Pompeii in the years before its famous burial. Grand villas with intricate mosaics and private gardens existed just streets away from crowded, multi-story apartment blocks called insulae, where families lived in single rooms. This was a social contract in balance of sorts. The wealthy enjoyed their luxuries, while the broader population had access to the city's public baths, reliable grain dole, and the security of Roman law. Now imagine that balance breaking. A prolonged drought reduces the harvest, the aqueducts bringing fresh water run lower. Suddenly, that grain dole is cut or the public fountains run dry. Who suffers first? The social contract, that unspoken agreement that the system provides a basic level of order and sustenance, begins to tear. Resentment festers. The lavish villas are no longer just symbols of success, but glaring evidence of hoarded resources. The city is no longer a place of shared security, but an arena of competition. We see this tragic shift vividly in the final centuries of the classic Maya civilization. Their great city-states like Tikal and Calakmul were once connected by trade, royal marriages, and shared cultural practices. But as the long-term environmental pressures of deforestation and drought took hold, something changed in the archaeological record. Monumental construction, once used to celebrate gods and kings, increasingly glorifies military victories. Defensive walls are built where none existed before. Inscriptions tell not of alliances and celestial events, but of captured rulers and sacked cities. The Maya world turned inward, fracturing into warring factions competing for the last productive farmland and reliable water sources. This internal warfare was both a symptom of the larger crisis and a cause of its acceleration. It diverted precious resources and labor from solving fundamental problems like food production, and it shattered the trust that holds a complex society together. Why would a farming family stay in a city that can no longer feed them and now also demands their sons for a distant war? The urban center, once the heart of safety and opportunity, becomes the epicenter of danger and deprivation. When faith in the system evaporates, the will to maintain it evaporates too. People do not simply walk away from a home, they walk away from a broken promise. If the ruling authority is seen as corrupt, inept, or solely self-interested, its legitimacy crumbles. Maintaining miles of canal or a complex sanitation system requires collective effort and a belief in a shared future. If that belief is gone, why bother to dredge the silt from the waterways? Why repair the public drain? The infrastructure itself begins to decay, not from a sudden disaster, but from 1,000 small decisions of neglect. This internal decay creates a vulnerability that is often exploited from the outside. A city divided by strife, with failing infrastructure and a disillusioned population, is a tempting target for neighbors or nomadic groups facing the same climatic hardships. The final act of abandonment, then, is rarely one single cause. It is the culmination of a cascade where environmental strain triggers social fracture, which in turn invites external threat, until the weight of simply staying becomes greater than the terrifying uncertainty of leaving. And sometimes the choice to leave is not an admission of defeat, but a profound adaptation in its own right. The wealth of a city is a story written in trade. Across the ancient world, prosperity was not just grown from the land, it was sailed in on ships and carried in along dusty caravan routes. When those connections are severed, the entire economic logic of an urban center can fall apart in a generation. This is the fourth, and often final, key to understanding abandonment, economic collapse, and the catastrophic disruption of trade networks. For a vivid example, look to the brilliant Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. Their palaces at Knossos were not just political centers, they were bustling economic hubs. The Minoans were master sailors, their distinctive ships forming a web of commerce across the eastern Mediterranean, trading exquisite pottery, saffron, and olive oil for copper, ivory, and other luxuries. Their entire sophisticated identity was tied to the sea. Then, around 3,600 years ago, the nearby volcanic island of Thera exploded in one of the largest eruptions in human history. While the exact timeline is debated, the consequences are clear in the archaeological record. Tsunamis would have smashed into northern Crete, devastating the vital coastal ports and likely destroying much of the fleet that was the source of Minoan power. Ashfall would have crippled agriculture. In an instant, the physical and economic landscape was rewritten. The trade routes that were their lifeblood were severed. Without the goods flowing in and out, the complex palace economy, which supported administrators, artists, and specialized craftspeople, had no reason to exist. The intricate society built on maritime trade could not sustain itself when the sea became a barrier instead of a highway. This pattern of economic fragility repeats in countless forms. A city might not rely on ships, but on a single overland route like the legendary Silk Road. The prosperity of oasis cities like Palmyra was entirely dependent on being a link in that chain, providing water, security, and a market for caravans moving between empires. If political instability made the route too dangerous, or if a new maritime route bypassed it entirely, the economic rationale for the city evaporated. The merchants packed up, the guards left their posts, and the brilliant water management systems that made life in the desert possible were left to be buried by sand. Think of an ancient city's economy as a delicate mobile, perfectly balanced. Each piece represents a different group: artisans making fine textiles, merchants organizing caravans, farmers producing a surplus to feed those who do not farm. This system works because of constant movement, the exchange of goods and services. Now, imagine cutting several of the strings that hold it all together. The import of a crucial raw material like tin for making bronze stops. The export market for the city's signature pottery dries up. Suddenly, the potters have no work. The merchants who shipped the pottery have no income. The farmers who sold food to the potters and merchants lose their customers. This is a cascade of unemployment and scarcity. The specialized skills that made urban life rich and diverse become liabilities. In this light, the choice to abandon the city is not a descent into chaos, but a tragic return to simplicity. When the complex economy fails, the most rational survival strategy is often to revert to a basic subsistence lifestyle. Why stay in a crowded, starving city where your craft is worthless, when you could move to the countryside, till a small plot of land, and at least feed your family directly? The city transforms from a beacon of opportunity into a monument to broken promises. This economic unraveling is almost never an isolated event. It is the direct symptom of the environmental and social pressures we have already discussed. A decades-long drought does not just kill crops, it makes overland trade routes impassable and dries up the rivers used for transport. Internal warfare does not just cost lives, it scares away foreign merchants and destroys the security needed for markets to function. Each factor feeds the others, creating a feedback loop of decline that challenges even the most determined and resilient leadership. And when the economy fails, it often pulls the curtain back on one last, profound question. What did the people truly believe about their place in the world and about the powers that were supposed to protect them? A city's walls cannot stop an invisible invader. The fifth and perhaps most intimate factor in the story of abandonment is the sudden, devastating arrival of epidemic disease. Even the most brilliant infrastructure was powerless against pathogens for which there was no scientific understanding. The sophisticated sewers of Mohenjo-Daro were designed to manage waste, not to combat a virus carried on a breeze. The crowded, vibrant markets and ceremonial plazas that were the heartbeat of an ancient metropolis could, in a matter of weeks, become the perfect engine for a pandemic spread. Consider the scale of a city like Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital built on a lake. At its height, it was a dense urban island of perhaps 200,000 people, connected by canals and causeways. This very connectivity, the source of its economic and political power, would have allowed an introduced illness to race through the population with terrifying speed. Historical accounts from later contact periods describe societies utterly ravaged by diseases like smallpox, for which they had no immunity. While the abandonment of Tenochtitlan followed a specific conquest, the pattern holds. A pandemic does not just claim lives, it systematically dismantles a society's functions. It decimates the skilled laborers who maintain the aqueducts, the soldiers who guard the gates, the administrators who coordinate the grain supply. The social fabric, already strained by environmental or political stress, tears completely under the weight of collective grief and fear. In this devastated state, a population becomes tragically vulnerable to a cascade of consequences. Malnutrition, resulting from those earlier agricultural failures, weakens immune systems, turning a serious outbreak into a catastrophic one. Survivors, traumatized and grieving, may come to see the city itself as cursed, a place of loss rather than a home. The very stones and streets become associated with suffering, making the psychological break from the urban center complete. Why would you stay to dredge a canal or repair a temple in a place that feels like a tomb? This biological shock acts as a grim and rapid accelerant, pushing a teetering civilization over the edge. When a significant portion of a generation is lost, the knowledge they held, the trades they mastered, and the oral history they carried can vanish with them. The intricate system, deprived of the human hands and minds that sustained it, grinds to a halt. And in the haunting silence that follows such a crisis, people are left to search for meaning, often looking not to the failing infrastructure around them, but to the heavens above, questioning the very covenant between themselves and the gods. The stones of a temple can stand firm long after the faith that built them has faded. This brings us to a sixth, deeply human factor in the story of abandonment, religious and ideological shifts. A city is more than its roads and reservoirs, it is an idea given physical form. It represents a society's deepest beliefs about the universe, its place within it, and the compact between its people and the powers they worship. When that core belief system transforms or collapses, the very reason for the city's existence can vanish into thin air. Consider the great ceremonial complexes of Choco Canyon in the American Southwest. For centuries, this was a spiritual and economic hub for the ancestral Puebloans, a landscape transformed with massive great houses aligned to celestial events. Yet its abandonment around the middle of the 12th century appears to have been a gradual and deliberate process. Archaeologists have found evidence of ritual closing with doorways and kivas, their sacred underground chambers carefully sealed or filled. This suggests not a panicked flight but a ceremonial departure. It hints at a profound cultural decision. A prolonged period of drought and hardship may have been interpreted not just as an environmental challenge, but as a spiritual one. Perhaps the location itself, once seen as a center of cosmic power, was now viewed as spiritually depleted or even polluted, a place where the connection to the divine had been severed. In such a climate, a new religious movement could easily take root, one that preached that harmony and salvation lay not in maintaining the old centers, but in a journey toward a new promised land. This would not have been a retreat but a purposeful pilgrimage, an ideological migration in search of renewed favor. This pattern reveals a powerful truth about ancient civilizations. The staggering labor required to build a pyramid, a barrage, or a great house was often justified by a commanding ideology, frequently centered on a ruler seen as a divine king or a living god. The Khmer god kings of Angkor are a perfect example. Their authority was inextricably linked to their role as intermediaries who ensured the fertility of the land and the favor of the gods. The monumental infrastructure they commissioned was both a practical tool and a theological statement, proof of their sacred mandate. But what happens when that mandate is questioned? If years of poor harvests and failing canals coincide with the reign of a weak or unpopular king, the people may begin to doubt the divine connection. The ideology that glued the social hierarchy together loses its persuasive power. If the king is no longer ensuring the rains, why should thousands toil to maintain his temple mountain? The entire rationale for the centralized state, and by extension the urban heart that supported it, evaporates. The abandonment then becomes a quiet referendum on a failed idea. People vote with their feet, leaving behind not just buildings but an outdated worldview. They carry their culture and knowledge with them, applying it to new places and perhaps new beliefs. This kind of departure is among the most poignant because it is a conscious choice. It is not a surrender to an overwhelming force, but a collective decision to seek a different answer, to build a new center for a renewed sense of meaning. It reminds us that the most resilient element of any civilization is not its stonework, but the adaptable human spirit that can choose to walk away from one story in order to begin another. And in walking away, these communities left behind a silent library of their lives, a puzzle for us to piece together centuries later. Sometimes, the most rational response to a crumbling world is to simply walk toward a new one. This seventh and final key factor in the story of abandonment is perhaps the most fundamentally human, the allure of migration and the call of new frontiers. When the old systems strain and the familiar landscape offers diminishing returns, the horizon itself can become a powerful incentive. This movement is rarely a mindless stampede, but often a calculated strategy for survival, a recalibration of an entire society into a form that the worn-out heartland could no longer support. A compelling and mysterious example comes from the turbulent era around 1200 BCE, a time historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the grand palaces of the Hittites and Mycenaeans fell silent, and even mighty Egypt was pushed to its limits. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions speak of relentless attacks by enigmatic groups they called the Sea Peoples. For a long time, these invaders were portrayed as mere marauders. But modern scholarship paints a more nuanced and relatable picture. Evidence suggests many of these so-called Sea Peoples were likely a complex mix of displaced communities, climate refugees, and opportunistic migrants. They may have been pushed from their own homelands by drought, famine, or seismic unrest, and then drawn into the power vacuum of failing empires, not just to destroy, but to find a place to settle. Their movement was a symptom of a wider systemic failure, and their migration was both a cause of further disruption and a desperate search for stability. This pattern of strategic dispersal repeats on a smaller, quieter scale throughout history. When a great city like Cahokia along the Mississippi began to struggle with overpopulation and resource depletion, its inhabitants did not vanish. Instead, the archaeological record suggests a gradual splintering. Family groups and clans likely made the decision to leave the crowded urban center, migrating out along the river networks to establish smaller, more manageable villages. In doing so, they traded the complexities and hierarchies of city life for a simpler, more decentralized existence that was better suited to the changing environment. This is a profound insight. Abandonment is not always an ending. It can be a metamorphosis. The knowledge of how to build, how to farm, and how to govern did not disappear, it simply diffused. The centralized model failed, so the culture adapted by spreading its seeds to new soil. The Grand Plaza lies empty, but the people and their traditions live on in 100 smaller clearings, a society that chose resilience through dispersal over rigidity in a single, straining location. To see this cycle of urban grandeur and deliberate departure in its most dramatic form, we must now turn our gaze to a city that mastered its environment like no other, only to be slowly reclaimed by the very jungle it sought to control. The haunting silence of the Maya jungle holds one of history's most profound cautionary tales. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, the brilliant urban heart of the classic Maya civilization ceased to beat. Cities like Tikal, with its pyramids scraping the sky, and Palenque, a masterpiece of art and architecture, were largely abandoned within just a few generations. This was not the end of the Maya people, but a dramatic and decisive end to their way of life as city dwellers. Their story is the ultimate case study of a perfect storm, where every factor we have discussed converged with devastating synergy. For centuries, these cities thrived through a delicate balance of intense agriculture, managed trade, and a spiritual political system centered on divine kings. The rulers derived their power from a sacred promise, their ability to commune with the gods to bring life-giving rains and bountiful harvests. This belief was carved into stone, celebrating their victories and their connection to the cosmos. But then, the environment began to shift. Scientific evidence from lakebed sediments tells a clear story of extended and severe drought during this very period. At the same time, pollen records show the landscape around major centers had been heavily deforested, likely to clear land for agriculture and to produce plaster for their monumental buildings. This dual assault of a changing climate and a degraded local ecology put the entire system under immense strain. Crop yields would have fallen, and the reservoirs and canal systems they depended on would have begun to fail. Hunger is a powerful destabilizer. As scarcity bit, the once cooperative network of city-states began to fracture. The archaeological record turns dark. Defensive walls were hastily erected around city centers that had been open for centuries. Inscriptions on monuments, which once told of celestial events and royal births, increasingly boast of military victories, the capture of rival kings, and the destruction of enemy cities. The sacred covenant was breaking, replaced by a desperate struggle for dwindling resources. This warfare made everything worse. It diverted labor from farming and maintenance, further crippling food production. It shattered trade routes and alliances, and with each conflict, the legitimacy of the ruling class eroded. How could a king be a god if he could not make it rain? How could he protect his people if he was leading them into ruinous wars over barren fields? The social contract dissolved. In this atmosphere of fear, hunger, and lost faith, the choice became clear. Why remain in a crowded, starving, and dangerous city where the old promises rang hollow? The population did not vanish. Instead, they made a rational, if heartbreaking, decision. They gradually dispersed, leaving the grand plazas and silent temples behind. They migrated back to the countryside, to smaller, sustainable villages where they could live in smaller kinship groups and practice a more flexible form of agriculture. The great stone cities, those awe-inspiring symbols of a cosmic order, were simply left to the vines and the trees. The Maya collapse teaches us that sophistication is no shield against a cascade of crises. It shows how environmental pressure can ignite social conflict, which in turn accelerates economic and ideological collapse until the very idea of the city becomes unsustainable. This pattern of converging stressors is not unique to the jungle, however. To see it unfold in a landscape of dazzling coastal beauty, we must travel across the world. The green silence of the Maya stands in stark contrast to the sun-baked bricks of another vanished world. Far to the east, along the banks of the mighty Indus River, the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa achieved a different kind of perfection. Their mystery is not one of warfare and fallen kings, but of eerie quiet and orderly departure. Flourishing over 4,000 years ago, these were marvels of premeditated design with straight streets, uniform bricks, and that revolutionary underground drainage network. Yet by around 1900 BCE, their grand avenues were emptying. The archaeological record here shows no layers of ash from sacked cities, no caches of weapons, no mass memorial sites from conflict. Instead, we find a slow fading, a gradual thinning out, as if the people simply decided, one generation at a time, that there was a better place to be. This peaceful exodus points to a culprit that is both impersonal and immense, a shift in the very geography that gave them life. The brilliance of the Indus Valley civilization was built on a profound understanding of their environment, specifically the rhythm of the Indus River. Their cities were masterpieces of hydraulic engineering, positioned to harness its annual floods for agriculture and channel its waters for daily use. But what happens when the river itself decides to move? Geological evidence suggests this is precisely what occurred. Tectonic activity, the slow grinding of the Earth's plates, can subtly alter a landscape over centuries. It can lift one section of land or lower another, redirecting the flow of a river as powerful as the Indus. Imagine the slow, creeping disaster of this. A canal system, perfectly aligned for generations, finds its intake point slowly silting up as the main channel migrates miles away. The reliable floodplain that fertilized their fields becomes a dry, cracked basin. Alternatively, the monsoons that fed the river's headwaters may have grown weaker or less predictable, a climatic shift that turned a life-giving pulse into a feeble trickle. Their entire civilization was engineered for a specific, reliable water source, and that source simply changed the rules. This leads to a fascinating and tragic possibility. The very social harmony that made the Indus Valley cities so remarkable, their uniformity and apparent lack of extreme social hierarchy, may have inadvertently made them less adaptable to such a fundamental crisis. Their systems were optimized almost perfectly for a stable reality. When that reality dissolved, they may have lacked the centralized, coercive authority to marshal a massive, desperate public works project to chase the river or radically reinvent their agriculture. There was no pharaoh to command the digging of a new canal for 1,000 miles. Instead, the response seems to have been pragmatic and communal. Populations likely began a gradual southward and eastward migration, following the water and more fertile land toward what is now India. This was not a collapse but a strategic dispersal. They took their culture, their technology of brick-making and town planning with them, seeding it into new communities. The lesson of the Indus Valley is a subtle but powerful one. It shows that a civilization can be too perfectly adapted. Their infrastructure was not destroyed by an enemy, but made obsolete by a planet in motion. Their abandonment was a quiet, collective decision to leave a beautifully designed machine behind because the fuel it was built to run on was gone. It underscores that sustainability is not about building the perfect system for today, but about building a society flexible enough to change when tomorrow arrives unrecognizably different. And this challenge of adapting to a changing environment connects these ancient stories directly to our own modern world, raising urgent questions about the legacy we are building right now. The story of Angkor is a testament to ambition meeting its ecological limits. As the capital of the Khmer Empire, it grew into a sprawling metropolis, the largest pre-industrial city on Earth, home to perhaps 1 million people. Its lifeblood was not just the devotion of its people, but a breathtaking feat of engineering, a vast hydraulic network of canals, reservoirs, and embankments designed to conquer the region's extreme wet and dry seasons. This system turned the landscape into a machine for survival, capturing monsoon rains in immense barrays to provide water through the parching months and supporting immense rice production. For centuries, it was a masterpiece of control. Yet, by the 15th century, this great engine of civilization began to seize. For a long time, history pointed a simple finger at invasion from the neighboring Siamese kingdoms. But modern archaeology, armed with tools like LiDAR that can see through the dense jungle canopy, reveals a far more complex and cautionary tale. It appears the very system that enabled Angkor's glory ultimately contributed to its vulnerability. The scale of the water network was staggering, but that scale demanded constant, precise care. Canals needed dredging, embankments needed reinforcing, and reservoirs needed clearing of silt. This required a vast, coordinated workforce, sustained by a stable and prosperous society. Then, the climate began to shift. Evidence suggests the region entered a period of intense volatility, with decades of particularly powerful monsoon rains. These weren't ordinary storms, they were catastrophic deluges that overwhelmed the city's carefully calibrated defenses. The canals, designed for a certain flow, were breached. Torrents of water, laden with soil and debris, scoured the landscape and deposited mountains of silt, clogging the arterial channels of the city. This environmental stress was compounded by the empire's own success. To feed its colossal population, vast tracts of forest upstream were cleared for rice paddies. Without tree roots to hold the earth, rainfall washed unprecedented amounts of sediment into the water system, accelerating the silting and altering the natural hydrology in unpredictable ways. The machine was gumming up, and here lies the pivotal moment. Maintaining this complex system was a social contract. It required the belief that the labor was worth it, that the central authority could organize it, and that the rewards, a stable food and water supply, would continue. As environmental failures led to poorer harvests and perhaps even devastating floods within the city itself, that faith would have been shaken. Social unrest, a questioning of the divine king's mandate, could have begun to simmer. The organized workforce needed for maintenance might have dwindled, diverted to farming or defense, or simply disillusioned. Once the meticulous upkeep faltered, the decline would have accelerated rapidly. A single breached canal left unrepaired could flood fields and homes. A silted reservoir could fail to provide water for the next dry season, causing crop failure. One failure triggered another in a cascade that the society could no longer reverse. Angkor's story teaches us that complexity can breed a hidden fragility. The most brilliant system is only as resilient as the society that maintains it, and both must be able to adapt when the environment itself changes the rules. This pattern of a civilization being challenged by the very world it sought to master is not confined to the jungles of Cambodia or the valleys of the Indus. To see it on a truly continental scale, we must look to a network of cities connected not by stone, but by a shared and devastating shock. Across the wide Mississippi floodplain, a different kind of monument rose not from stone but from earth itself. Cahokia stood as the greatest city of ancient North America, a bustling hub where up to 20,000 people once lived and traded. At its heart was Monk's Mound, a colossal earthen pyramid covering over 14 acres, a testament to communal labor on a staggering scale. The city was carefully planned with a grand central plaza, residential neighborhoods, and a mysterious circle of towering wooden posts, a wood henge, used to track the sun's journey and mark the seasons. This was a place of ceremony, commerce, and connection, a shining example of what indigenous societies could achieve. Yet by the 14th century, the great plaza fell quiet, and the wooden palisades that once surrounded the city's core were left to rot. The story of Cahokia's transformation reveals how a society's very success can plant the seeds for its own reorganization. The initial engine of its growth was likely the rich, fertile soil of the American bottom, the floodplain where the Mississippi and Missouri rivers meet. This was a breadbasket capable of producing massive surpluses of maize, squash, and beans. A reliable food supply allowed for specialization for artisans, priests, and leaders to emerge. But feeding and housing such a concentrated population came at a cost. The need for timber for construction and fuel led to widespread deforestation of the surrounding bluffs. As the trees vanished, the land became more vulnerable to erosion. Topsoil, the very foundation of their agricultural wealth, began to wash away into the rivers with every heavy rain. The environment that had nurtured Cahokia's rise was being gradually depleted by its presence. This slow burn resource pressure likely created a backdrop of growing hardship, but the final catalyst for change may have been profoundly social. Cahokia was almost certainly a cosmopolitan center, drawing people from diverse regions and cultural backgrounds. For a time, this diversity could have been a source of strength and innovation. But as resources grew tighter, the differences between groups may have become sources of friction. The centralized hierarchical system that built the great mounds, with a ruling elite living atop them, may have begun to feel oppressive to those living below. Some archaeologists point to intriguing evidence of what might have been an ideological revolution. Around the time of Cahokia's decline, there appears to be a shift in how people treated sacred spaces and objects associated with the old order. It is possible that a new spiritual or social movement took hold, one that rejected the concentration of power and the grand displays of authority symbolized by the mounds. The people may have simply decided that the cost of maintaining such a complex, stratified city was no longer worth it, that the promise of the center had been broken. The key insight here is that the inhabitants did not vanish into thin air. Cahokia was not an extinction event. Instead, the population appears to have made a conscious choice to disperse. They likely reintegrated into the broader fabric of the Mississippian world, joining or forming smaller, more decentralized chiefdoms along the riverways. The knowledge of farming, pottery, and community did not die, it simply diffused. The great mounds were left as silent sentinels, not over a grave but over a transformation. Cahokia's legacy is one of cultural adaptation, a powerful reminder that walking away from a grand physical place is not the same as abandoning a culture. Sometimes the most resilient act is to let the central monument go quiet so that 100 smaller communities can continue to thrive. This pattern of dispersal as a form of survival connects deeply to our final, overarching question: what do all these stories of empty cities and silent plazas ultimately tell us about our own world today? A civilization's greatest strength can become its most profound vulnerability. This is the central paradox of ancient urban life, where the brilliant systems built to ensure survival could, over time, weave a trap of dependency. Think of a vast irrigation network, a marvel of engineering that turns arid land into a breadbasket. It allows a population to boom, supporting artisans, soldiers, and priests who would otherwise be tied to the soil. But in doing so, it makes every single one of those lives utterly reliant on the canal's constant flow. The society is no longer just living on the land, it is living inside a machine it built, and everyone now depends on the machine's flawless operation. Similarly, a centralized grain storage system, like the great granaries of the Roman Empire or ancient Egypt, is a triumph of foresight. It smooths out the bad years, preventing famine when harvests are thin. Yet this very concentration of the food supply creates a single, glaring point of failure. If the silos are emptied by a sequence of poor harvests, or if they are seized by a rival faction during unrest, the entire population faces immediate crisis. What was designed as a buffer against shock becomes the epicenter of the shock itself. The infrastructure creates a specific, high-stakes equilibrium. It enables a way of life of incredible complexity and cultural richness, but it demands that certain conditions hold steady. The climate must remain within predictable bounds. The social order must remain stable enough to organize the massive labor required for maintenance. The economy must produce enough surplus to feed the specialists who keep the system running. This is a magnificent but delicate balance. And then there is the cost, the sheer resource consumption of maintaining such grandeur. Monumental construction projects, from the pyramids of Giza to the barrays of Angkor, are not just symbols of power. They are economic events that consume vast amounts of labor, timber, and food to sustain the workers. This diversion of energy and materials can strain the very environmental and economic foundations it is meant to glorify. A forest cleared to bake bricks for a temple is a forest no longer holding the soil on the hillside. The thousands of hands building a royal tomb are thousands of hands not tending fields or repairing the irrigation ditches. When external change arrives, whether a shift in the climate, a disruption in trade, or a fracture in the social order, this specialized infrastructure can become a liability. It is often too rigid, too expensive, or too deeply embedded to adapt quickly. A canal system engineered for one river's flow cannot easily be reconfigured when that river changes course. A society organized around maintaining a god-king's temple mountain may lack the flexibility to decentralize when that king's legitimacy fails. The very tools that built the civilization can lock it into a particular way of life that, when the world changes, becomes maladaptive. This invites a deeper, more urgent question for us today. If ancient brilliance could forge such fragile dependencies, what does true resilience actually look like? Is it about building bigger, more complex systems of control, or is it about fostering something else entirely? Something more adaptable and distributed? Resilience is not always measured by what stands, but by what endures. The haunting image of a silent city can trick us into seeing only an ending, a final collapse. But history whispers a more nuanced truth, one that moves beyond the simple binary of survival or extinction. Abandonment is often not an erasure, but an evolution, a deliberate strategy of adaptation in the face of overwhelming change. The people of a so-called fallen city rarely vanish from the earth. More often, they make a calculated choice to disperse, to carry their lives and knowledge away from a center that can no longer sustain them, integrating into new landscapes and existing communities. The monumental heart may stop beating, but the culture's pulse continues in 100 new places. Consider the fate of the Hittite Empire, a formidable Bronze Age power centered on the massive fortified capital of Hattusa. When that great city was abandoned around 1200 BCE, amid the wider turmoil of the era, it was not the end of the Hittite people or their identity. Their culture, language, and traditions persisted for centuries in a network of smaller, successor states known to historians as the Neo-Hittite kingdoms. These were not the empire, but they were its undeniable heirs, maintaining artistic styles, religious practices, and political customs in a new, decentralized form. The capital was gone, but the civilization transformed. This pattern is even more profound in the Maya world. To say the Maya civilization collapsed is a profound misunderstanding. The magnificent city-states of the classic period were indeed largely abandoned, their grand plazas reclaimed by jungle, but the Maya people did not disappear. Their descendants are alive today across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, speaking Mayan languages and carrying forward rich cultural traditions that have evolved over 1,000 years. The knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, and community did not die with Tikal or Palinc. It diffused, adapted, and persisted. The abandonment of the urban cores was, in this light, a tragic but successful adaptation. It was a societal decision to trade a fragile, centralized complexity for a more resilient, distributed way of life. When the environmental and social pressures became too great to support the dense population of a city, leaving became the rational path to preserving the community itself. It was a choice to prioritize people over place, culture over stone. This reframes these events not as failures, but as demonstrations of human flexibility. Faced with an unpredictable climate or broken social contracts, these societies opted for a strategic retreat. They exchanged the towering temple for the family hearth, the sprawling market for the kin-based village. The brilliance of their urban planning lived on, not in maintained monuments, but in the applied wisdom of how to organize a community, manage water, or chart the stars for planting. This adaptive dispersal is a quiet testament to our species' deepest strength, the ability to change course, to let go of one form of greatness to ensure the continuation of something even more essential, the people and their shared story. The empty city, then, is not a tombstone but a crossroads. It marks the point where a society chose a different path forward, leaving its grandest shell behind as it carried its living heart into an uncertain future. This perspective invites a final, crucial shift in how we view not just the past, but our own potential futures. But even the most resilient society can face a blow from which it cannot rise. Beyond the slow grind of drought and decay lies the unpredictable wild card of sudden, catastrophic disaster. While long-term environmental and social stresses create the conditions for collapse, a single, violent event can deliver the final, shattering blow. The story of Pompeii, frozen in an instant by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, is the most dramatic example. A city abandoned not by choice but by overwhelming force. Yet for other civilizations, a natural disaster did not have to bury a city to doom it. A massive earthquake could fracture the very skeleton of an urban center, toppling aqueducts, shattering temple columns, and collapsing the intricate drainage systems that were its lifeblood. If the society was already weakened by resource shortages or political strife, the capacity to mobilize the enormous labor and resources needed for reconstruction simply vanished. The disaster did not just destroy infrastructure, it destroyed the possibility of rebuilding it. Consider the fate of the brilliant Minoan civilization on Crete. Their maritime empire was a marvel of the Bronze Age, centered on grand palaces like Knossos. Then, around 3,600 years ago, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, exploded in one of the largest eruptions in human history. While the exact timeline is debated, the effects were cataclysmic. Tsunamis of staggering height would have raced across the sea, smashing into the northern coast of Crete, devastating its vital ports and likely destroying much of the fleet that was the source of Minoan power and trade. The eruption would have ejected vast amounts of ash into the atmosphere, potentially causing years of cooler temperatures and poor harvests across the region. This was not just a local tragedy, it was a systemic shock that severed trade routes, crippled agriculture, and shattered the economic foundation of their palace-centered society. The Minoans, perhaps already facing other pressures, found their world fundamentally altered in a matter of days. Other disasters could be equally decisive through slower but equally permanent means. A super flood, a once-in-a-millennium event, could do in one rainy season what siltation did over centuries. It could choke a vital harbor with debris, rendering a port city useless for international trade. It could breach every irrigation canal in a region, not just damaging them but depositing so much sand and gravel that restoring the system would be a task for generations. A society on the edge with depleted grain stores and a restless population might look at the scale of the ruin and make a collective, grim calculation. The cost of staying and rebuilding was greater than the cost of leaving. This highlights a crucial distinction. Resilient, healthy societies often recover from natural disasters. They have the surplus, the social cohesion, and the collective will to clear the rubble and start anew. But a disaster striking a city already hollowed out by drought, deforestation, or conflict is a different story. It breaks the cycle of recovery. The disaster becomes the catalyst that transforms a slow decline into an irreversible departure. It removes the last thread of hope that things might return to normal. These events are stark reminders of the raw, unpredictable power of the planet we build upon. They underscore that human history is not a separate story from natural history, but a continuous dialogue with forces far greater than our greatest monuments. And this dialogue forces us to ask, with all our modern knowledge and technology, are we any better at listening to the whispers of the earth before they become a roar? These silent stones do not give up their secrets easily. For generations, the story of a city's end was often told by its conquerors, or pieced together from fragments of pottery and the crumbling foundations of its last buildings. Today, the narrative is being rewritten not with shovels alone, but with a suite of technologies that feel almost like science fiction. The key to unlocking the past now flies overhead. Light detection and ranging, or LiDAR, is a revolutionary tool that uses laser pulses to map the ground surface with incredible precision, even through dense forest canopy. When researchers first used it over the jungles of Cambodia and Guatemala, the results were breathtaking. In an instant, the veil of vegetation was digitally stripped away, revealing the full, sprawling extent of ancient urban landscapes. At anchor, LiDAR showed a vast, low-density metropolis stretching far beyond the central temple complex, connected by an intricate web of canals and roads. In the Maya region, it exposed thousands of previously unknown structures, terraced fields, and defensive walls, proving these were not isolated ceremonial centers but densely populated, interconnected cities. This technology allows us to see the true scale of human engineering and, crucially, to identify points of failure within it, like breached embankments or silted water channels that written history never recorded. But to understand why a system failed, we need to know the world it operated within. This is where paleoclimatology comes in, the science of reading the Earth's old weather reports. Scientists drill deep into ice sheets in Greenland or Antarctica, extracting ice cores that contain tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere and layers of dust that tell of dry, windy periods. In lake beds, they analyze sediments where pollen from different plants or the chemistry of the mud itself reveals shifts between wet and dry epochs. And in the trunks of ancient trees, like the bristlecone pines of North America or preserved timbers from archaeological sites, they study the width of annual growth rings. A wide ring signifies a good, wet year. A series of narrow, pinched rings tells a story of prolonged drought. By correlating these natural archives with the archaeological timeline, researchers can now say with confidence that the decline of the Akkadian Empire coincided with a mega-drought, or that the ancestral Puebloans faced a profound dry spell as they left their cliff dwellings. This data moves us from speculation to evidence, showing how environmental stress provided the backdrop for societal strain. What people ate tells us how they lived and how they struggled. Archaeobotanists sift through ancient hearths, trash pits, and even the fossilized plaque on human teeth to recover plant remains, seeds, and phytoliths, microscopic silica structures from plant cells. This reveals the evolution of a diet, from a diverse range of wild grains and fruits to a heavy, risky dependence on a single staple crop like maize. Zooarchaeologists do the same with animal bones, tracking changes in hunting patterns, a shift from large, prized game to smaller, faster animals can signal overhunting or environmental degradation. Together, these specialists paint a picture of daily life and its slow constriction. They can show when soil fertility dropped, when deforestation began, and when the food web that supported a city started to fray at the edges. Sometimes the most important discoveries lie just beneath our feet, waiting to be seen. Ground-penetrating radar sends radio waves into the earth, mapping buried walls, roads, and chambers without moving a single scoop of soil. This non-invasive method allows archaeologists to plan targeted excavations and to understand the full layout of a site, from its grand plazas to its humble residential quarters, before digging begins. It preserves context and reveals a city's anatomy in a way random trenching never could. All of these scientific threads, the LiDAR maps, the climate data, the seeds and bones, are then woven together with the traditional work of excavation and, where we are fortunate, the deciphering of ancient texts. The Maya glyphs, once thought to be mere calendrical symbols, are now understood to record historical events, wars, and dynastic relationships, giving voice to the stones. This multidisciplinary approach is the modern gold standard. It has systematically dismantled simplistic old theories that blamed every collapse on mysterious invaders or barbarian hordes. Instead, it builds nuanced, evidence-rich models that acknowledge a far more complex truth: that civilizations are dynamic systems, deeply intertwined with their environment. Their endings are rarely due to a single villain, but to a cascade of interconnected pressures, a story we can now read not in legends, but in the layers of the earth itself. The past is a puzzle where the pieces rarely fit perfectly. Interpreting why a city fell silent is not a matter of simply reading an ancient answer from the ground. It is an active, often heated, debate among scholars. One of the most fundamental divides lies between those searching for a prime mover, a single catastrophic event like a drought or invasion, and those who advocate for a multi-causal model. The prime mover theory is compelling in its simplicity, offering a clear villain in the story. But modern archaeology increasingly suggests that societies as complex as Anka or the Maya did not possess a single off switch. Instead, they were intricate systems where environmental stress, social unrest, and economic failure amplified one another. A decades-long drought did not just kill crops, it strained the social contract, which in turn made coordinated responses to the crisis impossible, leading to a cascade no single factor could have caused alone. This leads to a critical interpretive challenge: the problem of chronological correlation. Just because tree ring data shows a severe drought at the same time a city's monuments stopped being built, we cannot automatically assume the drought was the sole cause. It might have been the final straw, or it might have coincided with a devastating epidemic, or a bitter internal power struggle that fractured the ruling class. The evidence layers on top of each other, and untangling which thread truly snapped first, or which one bore the most weight, is incredibly difficult. We see the symptoms of collapse in the archaeological record, but diagnosing the precise sequence of the disease remains an interpretive art. Our own modern lens also shapes how we view these ancient stories. Living in an era acutely aware of climate change and ecological limits, we might be quick to see these societies as inherently unsustainable, as cautionary tales of environmental overreach. But is that fair? Were the Khmer engineers who transformed a landscape to support 1 million people being reckless, or were they brilliant adapters who eventually faced a run of climatic bad luck beyond any system's capacity? This debate touches on the question of agency. Did the people of Cahokia or the Indus Valley have a choice? Framing their departure solely as a collapse can rob them of that agency, painting them as passive victims. Perhaps, as the evidence of careful site closures at Chaco suggests, leaving was a conscious cultural decision, a strategic choice to preserve their community in a different form. Seeing it as a planned adaptation rather than a chaotic flight changes the entire moral of the story. These ongoing debates are not a sign of failure in the field, but a sign of its vitality. They show that history is not a dusty book of settled facts, but a living conversation. Each new technological tool, from LiDAR to genetic analysis, adds another voice to that conversation, challenging old assumptions and revealing deeper complexities. This healthy uncertainty also serves as a crucial warning for us today. It highlights the immense difficulty of drawing direct, simplistic lessons from the past for our own modern context. Our world is connected in ways the ancients could never have imagined, with challenges of a scale and speed they never faced. Their stories are not blueprints, but mirrors, reflecting back the perennial challenges of balancing human ambition with the limits of the world we inhabit. They ask us not to find a perfect historical analogy, but to think deeply about the interconnectedness of our own systems and what true resilience might require. Our own skylines now echo with the same questions faced by those ancient planners. The silent ruins of Angkor and Tikal are not relics of a distant, irrelevant past. They are stark premonitions written in stone and earth for the urban world we have built today. Modern megacities with populations in the tens of millions are engineering marvels that dwarf the ancient world, yet they rest upon the same precarious pillars: resource security, social cohesion, and environmental stability. And those pillars are now shaking. Consider the profound parallel of water. Just as the Khmer Empire mastered hydraulics to feed 1 million people, modern cities like Bangkok, Jakarta, and Mexico City have sunk deep wells to quench their thirst, drawing down ancient aquifers faster than rain can replenish them. This is groundwater mining, a silent crisis of depletion that mirrors the silted canals of old. Meanwhile, coastal giants from Miami to Shanghai face the inverse threat, not scarcity but an overwhelming surplus, as rising seas and more powerful storms, fueled by a changing climate, test flood defenses in ways their engineers never anticipated. The ancient challenge of managing a capricious environment has become a global emergency. The social fractures are hauntingly familiar as well. The gleaming towers of a modern financial district can overlook neighborhoods struggling with scarcity, a disparity that echoes the divide between the Mesoamerican temple elite and the farming populace. When systemic stresses hit, whether a pandemic, an energy shortage, or an economic shock, these pre-existing inequalities are amplified, testing the social contract just as they did in ancient Rome or the Maya city-states. Our infrastructure, for all its digital brilliance, has created new forms of vulnerability. We depend on just-in-time supply chains, centralized power grids, and hyper-specialized systems that lack redundancy. A single point of failure, a cyber attack on a pipeline, or a hurricane downing a key electrical substation, can cascade into widespread hardship. This is the modern version of a silted reservoir or a breached canal, a failure in one highly optimized system that paralyzes many others. So what is the lesson, if not one of inevitable doom? The past does not prophesy collapse, it illuminates the principles of resilience. Ancient cities that failed often shared a common trait: they were too perfectly adapted to a specific, stable world. Their solutions were magnificent but rigid. The imperative for our time, therefore, is not to build bigger walls against the sea, but to cultivate flexibility. It means designing infrastructure with built-in redundancy, creating multiple pathways for water, energy, and food to reach a population. It means decentralizing power generation with solar and wind, so a failure in one area doesn't black out an entire region. It means reviving local agriculture and circular economies to shorten fragile supply lines. Most importantly, it means prioritizing social equity, because a city divided by mistrust and inequality cannot muster the collective will to adapt when crisis comes. Resilience is a social technology as much as an engineering one. Ultimately, these stories from the dust urge a profound shift in perspective. We must stop viewing our cities as finished monuments and start seeing them as dynamic organisms, constantly evolving in dialogue with a changing planet. The goal is not to conquer nature, as the ancients often sought to do, but to design for adaptation, to create systems that can bend without breaking. This requires long-term thinking that stretches beyond election cycles and quarterly reports, planning for the century ahead with the same foresight, though hopefully greater wisdom, as the builders of the great barriers. The empty plazas of the past are not just haunting ruins, they are the most powerful classrooms we have. They teach us that sustainability is not about permanence, but about the capacity for thoughtful, collective change. Our future may depend less on what we are brave enough to build, and more on what we are wise enough to leave behind or gracefully transform. The decision to walk away echoes for centuries in the stories our people tell. Beyond the environmental data and the fallen stones lies a quieter, more intimate legacy, the psychological imprint left on the survivors and their descendants. Abandoning a city was never just a logistical choice, it was a profound cultural trauma, a severing of ties to the very ground that held their ancestors and their gods. Imagine the weight of that final look back at the towering temple or the great mound, knowing you might never see it again, that the hearths of your grandparents would grow cold. This rupture was not forgotten. It was woven into the fabric of memory, transformed into the myths and oral histories that guide a culture forward. Across the world, foundational stories speak of great floods that forced a new beginning, of long journeys through darkness in search of a promised land, of heroes who led the people out of a dying place. These are not mere fables. They are often the poetic, preserved echoes of real historical catastrophes, the psychological processing of a community's deepest loss. For the descendants of the people who left Cahokia, the Great Mound may have lived on in legend as a place of origin, a story told to explain where they came from and why they now lived dispersed along the rivers. For the Maya, the jungle swallowed cities like Tikal, but the memory of those places as centers of ancestral power and former glory likely persisted, perhaps becoming cautionary tales about hubris or stories about a time when the world was different. This cultural memory holds a complex duality. On one hand, it carries a deep, ancestral grief for what was lost, the sacred sites and the established order. On the other, it fiercely celebrates the narrative of survival and renewal. The story is not just about the city that was left, but about the people who had the strength to leave, to endure the journey, and to build anew. This psychological legacy is a powerful force. It can shape identity, fostering a sense of resilience rooted in having overcome a great trial. It can influence future decisions, perhaps instilling a cultural caution against over-centralization or a deep reverence for the signs of environmental change. To understand this is to complete the picture. Archaeology gives us the when and the how, the silt in the canals and the dates on the monuments, but the human heart gives us the why that matters most. The choices were made by individuals who felt fear as the rains failed, grief as they closed the door on their home, and a stubborn hope as they turned toward an uncertain horizon. Their emotional journey, their negotiation of profound loss, and their determination to carry their culture forward is the true heart of the historical mystery. It transforms an ancient city from a mere site of collapse into a landmark of the human spirit, a place where a society ended one chapter, heavy with sorrow, so that its story could continue. The shadow of the invader has long loomed large in our stories of collapse. For generations, historians often pointed to a single, dramatic culprit when a city fell silent, the conquering army from beyond the walls. This narrative is powerfully simple, a clear tale of us versus them, of civilization succumbing to barbarian force, and without a doubt, invasion did happen. The sack of Rome in the year 410 is a stark and famous chapter, a moment where the unthinkable became real for the heart of an empire. Yet modern archaeology asks us to look deeper, to see the ground crumbling beneath the gates before the battering ram ever strikes. The concept of the barbarian horde overwhelming a healthy, thriving metropolis is now understood to be more myth than common reality. More often, the successful invasion is not the cause of a society's end, but a symptom of its advanced decay. Think of it not as a healthy tree being chopped down, but as a storm finally toppling a tree already rotted from within by drought, disease, and parasites. External attackers, whether nomadic groups or rival kingdoms, are often opportunists of the highest order. They excel at exploiting weakness. The enigmatic sea peoples who contributed to the late Bronze Age collapse across the eastern Mediterranean likely did not emerge from a vacuum to destroy a perfectly stable world. Instead, they moved into a region already buckling under severe drought, harvest failures, and crumbling political alliances. Their raids and migrations were the final, violent tremor in an earthquake that had been building for decades. They did not create the crisis, they capitalized on it. This reframing is a crucial maturation in how we understand history. It moves us away from simplistic stories of good versus evil or civilized versus savage, and toward a more honest, systemic view. A sophisticated urban culture represents a massive concentration of wealth, food, and resources. For an outside group to successfully storm such a place and hold it, the defenders' cohesion must already be fractured. Their armies may be underfed and underpaid from economic strain. The population may be disillusioned with leaders who have failed to solve environmental hardships. The social will to stand together on the ramparts may have evaporated. In this light, the invading force is less a primal destroyer and more of a grim catalyst, delivering the final blow to a society already on its knees. It is the coup de grace, the merciful or merciless ending to a prolonged and painful decline. This shift in perspective does not diminish the reality of conflict or the trauma it brought, but it places it within a broader, more interconnected story. It asks us to see the abandoned city not as a victim of a single evil, but as a complex system that failed under a cascade of pressures, where the breach in the social wall ultimately proved as fatal as the breach in the stone one. A brilliant civilization does not simply run out of time. It runs out of energy. This is the core insight of a transformative idea known as the systems collapse theory, pioneered by the scholar Joseph Tainter. He proposes we stop looking for a single villain, like a drought or an invader, and instead see these ancient societies as complex, problem-solving machines. Their initial rise is a story of brilliant engineering, both social and physical. To manage water, they create a class of canal supervisors. To distribute grain, they need record keepers and tax collectors. To build monuments that legitimize the state, they require architects, labor coordinators, and soldiers to guard the stores. Each new challenge is met by adding a new layer of organization, a new specialization. And for a long while, this works beautifully. The returns are massive, reliable harvests, impressive monuments, growing populations, and cultural flourishing. The complexity pays for itself, but Tainter identifies a dangerous tipping point, the law of diminishing returns on complexity. Over generations, the cost of maintaining this elaborate system begins to creep upward. The bureaucracy itself needs feeding and housing. The ever-growing infrastructure demands constant, meticulous upkeep. More and more of society's energy and resources are diverted simply to keep the complex machine running, just to maintain the status quo. The benefits, meanwhile, start to plateau. You cannot irrigate a field twice. A second grand temple does not double the harvest. The marginal return on each new investment of labor and wealth gets smaller. The society finds itself on a treadmill, running faster and faster just to stay in place. Then the major stressor arrives, the decades-long drought, the volcanic winter, the shift in trade routes. A healthy, resilient system could absorb this shock, but a complex, high-maintenance system is uniquely vulnerable. Addressing the new crisis requires yet another surge of coordination, another massive expenditure of energy and resources, a Herculean effort to dredge more canals or ration more grain. Yet the society is already stretched to its limit, its surplus consumed by the cost of its own sophistication. The complex solution is now the problem. It has become too expensive, too brittle, and too slow to adapt. In this light, the moment of abandonment is not a failure of will, but a rational calculation. The people, often at a grassroots level, make a stark choice. They opt out of the high-cost system. Walking away from the grand city and its draining demands is not a descent into chaos. It is a strategic shift toward a simpler, more sustainable way of life. Dispersing into smaller, decentralized communities means shedding the costly overhead of kings, priests, and monumental projects. It means focusing energy directly on survival, on family and clan, rather than feeding a vast, impersonal machine. Tainter's framework elegantly weaves together the threads we have followed: the environmental trigger, the economic strain, the social fracture. It views the city not just as a collection of buildings, but as a living system that processes energy. And when the energy required to sustain it exceeds the energy it can reliably provide, the system becomes non-viable. The lights quite literally go out. This theory gives profound agency to those who left. They were not fleeing in blind panic. They were making a collective decision to seek a better return on their effort elsewhere. Their departure was the ultimate market correction, a vote against a bankrupt model of civilization. And if complexity carries this inherent fragility, it forces us to ask a daring question about our own world. What are the diminishing returns on our global system's vast complexity, and where might the breaking points lie? This pragmatic view reframes the very meaning of abandonment. When the cost of staying outweighs the benefit of leaving, walking away becomes an act of profound collective wisdom. The choice to abandon a city is rarely a first resort, but a final calculation made after years of diminishing returns. Consider the immense labor required to maintain a sprawling metropolis, the thousands of hands needed just to keep the status quo functioning. Every stone aqueduct channeling water from distant mountains requires constant patrols and repairs. Every mile of defensive wall demands guards and masons. The Grand Canal that feeds the fields must be dredged season after season, or it silts into uselessness. This upkeep is the hidden tax of urban life, a relentless drain on a society's energy and resources. For generations, the bounty of the land and the flow of trade make this cost worthwhile. But when that bounty shrinks, when trade routes falter or harvests grow thin, the equation flips. The city transforms from an engine of prosperity into a voracious consumer of the very surplus it can no longer reliably produce. At this critical juncture, the community faces a stark ledger. Do we spend our last reserves of grain and manpower to repair the main aqueduct for another season? Or do we use that same energy to move our families to a place where water flows freely from a spring? The rational choice, however heartbreaking, becomes clear. This is not surrender, it is strategic reallocation. We see this logic play out on an imperial scale with the Roman Empire's long, deliberate withdrawal from Britannia. By the early 5th century, maintaining legions and a vast administrative apparatus on that distant, restive island was consuming wealth, and soldiers needed to shore up the empire's crumbling heartland. The order to pull back was not an admission of military defeat so much as a cold, strategic consolidation. It was the empire choosing to amputate a limb to save the body, redirecting finite resources to more defensible and vital cores. On a much more intimate scale, this same calculus guided countless smaller communities. Archaeological evidence across Europe and the Americas shows villages that were not destroyed but peacefully relocated. A farming community living on a fertile plain after generations of increasing raids might collectively decide to move their entire settlement to a nearby, steeper hilltop. They would trade easy access to their fields for the security of a defensible position. Another group, watching their local stream dry up year after year, might pack their tools and pottery and move downstream to a confluence of rivers, sacrificing their ancestral homes for reliable water. These were not panicked flights but planned migrations. They involved difficult communal decisions, the weighing of risks, and the coordination of movement. This perspective grants immense agency to our ancestors. It sees them not as passive victims of circumstance, but as active problem solvers assessing their options under extreme pressure. They were managers of a shared survival portfolio, and sometimes the most prudent investment was to cut their losses on a failing asset, the city itself, and reinvest their cultural capital in a new location. It reveals that the highest goal of a society is not necessarily permanence in stone, but the perpetuation of the community itself. The intelligence of a culture is measured not just by the monuments it builds, but by the courage it has to leave them behind when they no longer serve the people. In the silent spaces they left, we find not evidence of failure, but the ghost of a difficult, deliberate choice. The empty city is never truly empty. Long after the last resident has gone, their creation continues to speak, its silence echoing across centuries to shape the imaginations of those who come after. For cultures encountering these staggering ruins without a written history to explain them, the stones told a different story. The massive, cyclopean walls of Mycenaean citadels were believed by classical Greeks to have been built by a race of one-eyed giants, the Cyclopes. The immense geometric mounds of North America were often woven into the origin stories of later Native American nations, sometimes seen as the work of ancient spirit beings. These legends are not mere superstition, they are profound acts of interpretation, faced with a scale of achievement that seemed to surpass ordinary human capability. The human mind reached for the mythic. The ruin became a sacred space, a testament to a lost age of giants or gods, inspiring both awe and a humbling sense of our own place in the long arc of time. This transformation from lived-in space to memory place is one of the most powerful legacies of abandonment. The site is no longer a practical location. It becomes a symbol, a focal point for collective memory and identity. For the modern nation of Cambodia, the towering silhouette of Angkor Wat is not merely a tourist attraction. It is the central emblem on their national flag, a daily reminder of resilience and historical grandeur that anchors their cultural pride in a tangible stone reality. This repurposing turns the ruin into a living participant in the present, a source of unity and a bridge to a foundational past. The work of the archaeologist is in essence a dedicated conversation with this silence. Each careful excavation, each mapped foundation and catalogued artifact is an attempt to translate the stone library. We are not just uncovering buildings, we are listening for the whispers of daily life, the echoes of market chatter, the imprint of rituals, and the evidence of technological triumph. This scholarly reclamation is a deliberate rescue from oblivion. By piecing together the narrative of why a city flourished and why it was left behind, we pull these places back into the stream of human story. We grant them a continued existence in our understanding, ensuring that the choices, both brilliant and tragic, of those ancient planners are not entirely lost. In this way, the ruin transcends its own demise. It stands in the landscape as a permanent question, etched in weathered stone and overgrown plazas. It challenges every generation that encounters it to ponder the same essential dilemmas, the balance between ambition and sustainability, the line between confidence and hubris, and our own fragile relationship with the relentless passage of time. Their silent presence initiates a quiet dialogue between the past and the future. They remind us, without uttering a single word, that all human achievement is contingent, resting upon a delicate and ever-shifting equilibrium with the natural world and with each other. To walk among their stones is to feel the weight of that truth and to carry its sobering, essential lesson forward. Memory is a river that carves its own course through time. When a city falls silent, the factual details of its collapse, the precise dates, and the names of kings often fade first. What remains, and what often grows more powerful, is the story. Over generations, the raw historical event is reshaped by awe, by trauma, and by the human need for meaning. It transforms into myth and legend, and within these stories, we often find the preserved heartbeat of a forgotten truth. Take the biblical narrative of the Exodus, a foundational story of a people led from bondage. While debated by scholars, some see within its layers a distant echo of a real historical period of upheaval. The late Bronze Age collapse saw the Egyptian New Kingdom's grip weaken, its frontier outposts in Canaan abandoned or destroyed amid widespread social unrest and the movement of displaced peoples. The story of plagues and a dramatic departure could be a powerful cultural memory of that chaotic era, a way to explain a profound liberation that was also a time of immense hardship and transition. The factual city abandoned becomes the metaphorical house of bondage left behind. Similarly, the haunting legend of Atlantis, described by Plato as an advanced island kingdom that sank beneath the sea in a single day and night, has captivated imaginations for millennia. While likely a philosophical allegory, its core imagery, a sophisticated maritime power destroyed by the ocean, aligns strikingly with the fate of the Minoan civilization after the catastrophic eruption of Thera. The memory of quakes, tsunamis, and the sudden end of a seafaring culture could have traveled across the Mediterranean for centuries, slowly morphing into the tale of a lost continent. These stories are not history in a literal, textbook sense. They are history in an emotional and cultural sense. They encode the deep trauma of catastrophic change, the wonder at a vanished greatness, and the enduring question of why. Native American oral traditions from various regions sometimes speak of great cities or mounds built by ancestors or spiritual beings. Narratives that preserve the knowledge of places like Cahokia or the cliff dwellings of the Southwest long after their builders had dispersed. The story becomes the vessel that carries the essence of the past forward, even when the specific coordinates are lost. This transformation from fact to folklore reveals a fundamental human process. When faced with the incomprehensible, with the sight of a monumental city lying empty for reasons no living person remembers, the mind seeks a narrative. It weaves explanation from the threads of memory, fear, and reverence. A prolonged drought might become the wrath of a displeased god. A forgotten war might become an epic battle between heroes and monsters. The abandoned city itself becomes a character in the story, a silent witness to a moral lesson about hubris or a reminder of a lost golden age. In this way, the stones find a voice long after their builders are gone. They speak not through inscriptions but through the legends they inspire. These myths are a testament to the enduring impact of these places. They prove that abandonment is never an absolute end. It is a transition from a physical reality to a psychological and cultural one, from a lived-in space to a story that shapes identity, warns future generations, and satisfies our timeless need to find pattern and purpose in the ruins of time. Sophistication is no guarantee of permanence. The silent plazas of Tikal and the silted canals of Ankara are not tombstones but classrooms. Their most profound lesson is that the greatest threats to a civilization rarely arrive as a single foreign army. Instead, they emerge from within the delicate, often invisible, dance between a society and the world it inhabits. From the Maya pushing against a deforested landscape to the Khmer engineers whose magnificent water network was overwhelmed by a volatile climate, we witness a recurring truth. These cultures did not fail because they were ignorant. They stumbled because the systems they perfected, the very foundations of their glory, could not withstand the long-term pressures they themselves helped to create. Their stories are case studies in unintended consequences, where the solution of one generation becomes the vulnerability of the next. The social strains that followed, the questioning of leadership and the fraying of communal bonds, show us that environmental stress and human conflict are not separate chapters, but intertwined lines of the same story. Their ultimate choice to gather their families and walk away from stone marvels reframes abandonment not as a defeat, but as a profound and pragmatic adaptation. It was a vote for survival over symbolism, a decision to preserve the community even if it meant leaving its grandest shell behind. This legacy speaks directly to our modern moment. We now inhabit a planet of interconnected megacities, facing climatic shifts and resource pressures on a global scale. The ancient stones urge us to listen. They ask us to build not for rigid permanence but for resilient flexibility, to design systems with redundancy, and to prioritize social equity as the bedrock of collective endurance. Their mystery endures not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a wisdom to be heeded. Let their silence remind us that the true measure of a civilization may not be the height of its monuments, but the depth of its foresight and the courage of its adaptability. If this journey through time resonated with you, we would love to hear which ancient city's story left the deepest impression. Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more explorations into history's enduring